It is really great to have you here. It's not often that we get so many blue food people in one place. And it has been 6 years since we did that at Stanford. So we are very happy to have you back on campus and to have a chance to be together outside our Zoom squares. So thank you, all of you, for coming. And I want to in particular thank Joshina and Andrea, who have made this event happen. So please, thank you. I think you've met them both, but they're the ones who have all the answers. So, and a lot goes into pulling off something like this. So I want to start there. It has been 6 years since we met here and set a lot of work in motion. And so I thought maybe I would use these minutes to take us back through a bit of that history, because it is context for the work we're now setting out to do together. Hi, Roz. I'm going to start with you two. So 2017, Theo McKaylee and I took over as directors of the Center for Ocean Solutions. And one of the things that struck us is that for all the research being done on fisheries and aquaculture, it was largely disconnected from all the work being done on food and agriculture. And so we enlisted Roz first as the obvious place to build a bridge between those two worlds, and Pam Matson, who was then the dean of the School of Earth Sciences. And together, brought together scholars from across those domains, from leading scholars in fisheries and aquaculture, people like William Chung and Zling Chao and Steve Gaines, and leading scholars from the world of food and agriculture, like Mario Herrera from Cornell, like Roz, like Pam. Really to begin to look at how could we begin to develop a research agenda that brought those two worlds together, that looked at how fisheries and aquaculture could be thought of, considered, explored within the context of food system programs and policy. At the same time, and so that was importantly, the beginning of a collaboration with Springer Nature. They sent 4 editors to the first meeting in January 2019, and that began the conversations about how we could work together to elevate these issues and elevate research on these issues. And it led pretty quickly to a collaboration with the University of Stockholm and a follow-on meeting 6 months later in Stockholm in June of 2019. In parallel, the World Economic Forum had convened something called the Friends of Ocean Action, and the Friends of Ocean Action brought together initially 50 ocean leaders from around the world, and part of what came out of that was a policy conversation about not only is there a gap or a division between these two worlds in research, they're also divided in policy. And all the global discussions about the future of food systems, how do we feed a world of 10 billion people within the limits of this planet, were discussions about crops and livestock. And so out of the Friends of Ocean Action, a discussion between us and the FAO and EAT and others, came the idea that we need on the policy side to engage that divide. And the result was the Blue Food Assessment. So the Blue Food Assessment, designed as the first concerted effort to understand the role of blue foods in food systems and to bring that into the policy world. So specifically keyed to the UN Food Systems Summit, which would be 2 years later, as an opportunity to elevate these issues. It was done, chaired by Bea Krona and by Roz. It was initially these 9 papers, and I'm happy to say we got 8 of them, which is pretty good, especially since COVID hit the month after our kickoff meeting. And 5 of those papers, despite the challenges of COVID for us and for peer review, 5 of those papers were published a week before the summit. In Nature, one of them on the cover, Jessica's paper on the cover, with an editorial, with a podcast, with a website devoted, on the Nature site, devoted to elevating blue foods. And that, of course, was accompanied by our own report, which is here's what this means for decision makers. So all those pieces were part of bringing blue foods into the heart of scientific discussions, but also discussions about food policy. Several things came out of that, and I'm not going to take you very deep into these, but just to give you a sense of the scope. One thread that runs through all the papers in the Blue Food Assessment is the extraordinary diversity of this resource. And for many people that was well known, but for many others it was brand new. As I like to say, there is one species of chicken raised all over the world. There are several thousand species of blue foods raised or harvested for food. And that diversity creates all sorts of possibilities, not least for resilience. Then in papers, is Chris here yet? Okay. In paper led by Chris and Zach and several others in this room, the first paper was on nutrition. and really helping people realize that many blue foods are superfoods, rich in many nutrients that are vital for healthy development. This is my favorite example. This little fish raised in fish ponds across Bangladesh accounts for 1/3 of the zinc, half the iron, and 98% of the vitamin A in the national diet. So really powerful resources for meeting nutrition challenges. A second is the recognition that blue foods can have a much lower footprint than terrestrial sources of protein. The paper that Jessica led, it illuminated that. It tells us that most of the blue foods that account for most of production are overall comparable to chicken, and many of them much better. And so there is, across that diversity, the opportunity to significantly lower the footprint of the food system. Demand, paper led by Roz with colleagues, gave us a first look into, okay, what are the forces, the factors that shape demand in culture and dietary preference and demographics and other factors that help us understand both how demand has grown and how we can expect it to grow in the future. And on the production side, spotlighting, something that people inside already knew, but people outside did not, that actually most of the food we eat is produced by small-scale producers, and they are incredibly diverse. Not as diverse as species, but very diverse in their circumstances, in their possibilities, in their constraints. And so really bringing to light that ecosystem of producers who are the heart of the system. Now, every food system has challenges, and I'm sorry to say that blue foods is not an exception to that. So one of them is climate. Paper that was led by William and Michelle Tickler from our team really looked at how is climate change going to ripple through these various blue food systems? What impacts can we expect it to have? And how well are governments positioned to actually deal with those impacts? So how can we begin to get a sense of resilience to climate change and what resilience needs to be built? In a paper led by Ling, the vulnerability of blue foods to environmental pressures of other kinds, plastic pollution, but also coastal pollution of various forms and other stresses to understand, okay, what needs to be addressed if we're going to have healthy blue food systems. And justice, a paper led by Christina Hicks and Jessica, which actually for me was both important and hopeful, which is to say, illuminating the challenges of justice across the system, that there are many marginalized populations, and especially consistently women, who are excluded from the benefits of the blue food system and often excluded from governance. Right? But that where governments had taken on those challenges, their policy actions had made a difference. So there were things one could do to begin to remedy that challenge in the blue food system. And finally, the synthesis led by Bea Krona, which pulled all this together and said, okay, what does this mean for decision makers? Given any set of national priorities, how can blue foods be relevant to what you do? And the most obvious single piece of that is that to the extent that you substitute fish for cows, there are big potential gains, both for health, heart disease, and so forth, and of course also for the climate. But all of that insight translated into decision-making form. So if you are a development policymaker, you think in these terms, you think in the SDGs. And the overall message of the Blue Food Assessment is blue foods are super relevant to your ability to achieve these goals. To put it a different way, the ambition of this work, and I think the impact of this work, has been to help decision makers at the highest level recognize that blue foods are actually important for what they're trying to accomplish. That blue food, it's an attempt to, and I think we are seeing success in, elevating from the fisheries ministers, who are always on the margins of power in the government, except for a few island states, to the finance ministers, food ministers, prime ministers, who have to deal with the core challenges of development. And this research is helping to bring these possibilities onto their table. Now, while all this science was being done, there was a very concerted effort to bring blue foods into the policy process. Many partners, core partners, were the Environmental Defense Fund, Carly is here, WWF, EAT, and the World Economic Forum. So intensive, collective, coordinated engagement with the summit process so that blue foods were prominent throughout. I have a whole separate presentation on that for those of you who really want to get down into the details, but a really important complement to the development of the science. And the result was that blue foods were prominent in the UN Food System Summit process. The chair of the summit and the UN Ocean Envoy together reached out to all the participants to emphasize the importance of featuring blue foods. They featured in presentations and in outcomes. One of the principal outcomes was the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. Now 40 countries and many NGOs and academic institutions continuing to work together to elevate blue foods in international discussions. And one example of that is the UN Ocean Conference we had just last June. There were 9 plenary sessions on ocean action, and one of those 3-hour sessions was devoted to the blue food agenda. Now, many of you are doing exciting work on blue foods in many contexts. I'm going to just take one as an example, because it's the one we're working in, and I know more about it. So I want to just give you a sense, though, of the opportunities we're seeing for all this work to actually hit the water. And one opportunity is Indonesia, which by many measures is the most important, certainly one of the most important ocean nations on Earth. And after the Blue Food Assessment came out, Indonesia, the Ministry of Planning in Indonesia came to us and said, could you help us bring blue foods into our national development plan? And could you then help us develop a blue food assessment for Indonesia to guide implementation of that plan? And so our team here with many, many partners in Indonesia have been working with the Planning Ministry over the last 3 years to deliver on that ambition. And the opportunity is one you all would know well, which is that diversity of blue foods translates into huge diversity in both in terms of their nutritional opportunities they present and in terms of their footprint. So if you look across the hundreds of species that are produced for food in Indonesia, they each represent a very different set of possibilities for reducing the footprint of the food system and for addressing nutrition challenges. And so a national level blue food assessment allows you to get at that in a very granular way, in a way that's simply not possible at a global level. So the Blue Food Assessment of Indonesia was published in August of last year. We can give you the link. If you go through the Blue Food website, you will find the link. It is the work of many researchers from across Indonesia and other institutional partners, but it is a product of the Ministry of Development Planning, which is important, I think, to its position in the government. And just to give you a couple of examples from Zach's work of what this kind of analysis allows. So from the data that we were able to get from the government and that Zach was able to work with, we have information on the species produced and consumed in every one of the 500 districts across the country, combined with nutrition data that allows us to say a lot about the opportunities blue food represents in each of those places. We have granular information about the nutrient content of every species commonly consumed. This is only half the table. It also has aquaculture and preserved fish, but then you couldn't read it. But what you can see from this is that if you compare blue foods to the terrestrial sources of protein in gold, blue foods are just much, much better on a whole bunch of things that matter, right? And this brings to life the nutritional potential that we've been highlighting over the last several years, but in the specific context of this country. And in the process, you're also able to begin to get a window into cost. Obviously, prices vary across a country as vast as Indonesia, but this tells you that all blue foods are less expensive than beef. Surprise, surprise. But also many of them less expensive than chicken. So as a source of animal protein, actually quite competitive in this context. Now, this is the end. So the Blue Food Assessment published in August. In the meantime, a new president takes office, and the new president decides that cracking nutrition is his core domestic priority. So he sets in motion a program that aims to provide free meals to 82 million people every day. Right? That's 62 million school children and another 20 million mothers and infants. They're already at 60 million people implementing this program. You can imagine moving at that pace. There have been lots of challenges in this program. But at the same time, there's an ambition here that is, of course, vitally important for a country in the situation of Indonesia, and which they see as clearly centrally important to their ambitions to become a high-income nation by 2045. So this program, feeding 62 million school children every day, is of course centered on nutrition. And what we see now is the government saying, all right, so how can Blue Foods help us meet the goals of this program? It can't just be chicken and eggs, right? How can we bring Blue Foods into this program? And the planning ministry has come back and said, okay, how do we figure out how we can do the things that the Blue Food Assessment said are so important? How can we make sure, how can we look at the small-scale fisheries sector, small-scale aquaculture sectors, which are here, as in other places, the heart of the blue food economy? How can we look at those sectors and figure out how we can source blue food from those producers in a way that improves their livelihoods, provides better nutrition to their children, and actually creates incentives for better stewardship of coastal resources? Now, that's a pretty tough set of questions, but it's the right set of questions and fundamentally important to realizing the aspirations of the work we set out on 6 years ago. And so that's the work that now lies ahead, and we are very eager for anyone who wants to be engaged in that because the possibilities are, of course, huge. So, what now? I should try and give you an overview of the research to be done that lies ahead. There is so much, right, to be done. So let me just highlight two things that run through these 2 days. So one is the need to continue to deepen our understanding of the sector. It's a complicated sector, right? I mean, there's a lot to figure out. And the work that we will be doing here over these 2 days on understanding, well, that we'll hear about shortly, about understanding coastal fishing communities more deeply than we do now, but also understanding then how those coastal communities, how small-scale fishers interact with the world of trade in a commodity that is the most traded food commodity in the world, fundamentally important to finding ways to really make progress here. And similarly, how do we help countries like Indonesia, but hopefully many others, actually embrace this agenda and take it forward? So what can we learn from those who are starting on that path? And how can we develop insights that help countries actually do what can be done in a way that improves their food system, but also sustains these resources for the longer term? So that's where we are. This is Blue Food Futures. There's a QR code. It'll take you straight to the website. Very proud of that. But this is what the Blue Food Futures program is all about, is how do we actually come together around the challenges that lie ahead and help governments actually meet them. And it is this partnership with that mission, but this meeting is a really important milestone in that effort. Thank you.
Now, we get to the more exciting part of the session. We're going to hear directly from the future of this field, our Blue Food Futures Fellows. These are our emerging Blue Food stars, and they're doing critical on-the-ground work around the globe. They will each share a snapshot of their research, taking us on a journey from Latin America to the coast of Kenya and South Africa, and to the river deltas of Bangladesh. So first, we are going to hear from Liliana Seria Castillo, one of our inaugural fellows, who will start us off with her work in Latin America. Liliana is an interdisciplinary marine scientist working hand-in-hand with coastal communities in Honduras and Puerto Rico. She's here to explore a powerful question: what can the food on our plates reveal about the land, the coast, and the ocean as a lived territory? So please welcome Liliana.
Well, as Eugenia said, I named the presentation What Food Reveals: Land, Coast, and Ocean as Lived Territories in Latin American Fishing Communities. Before I start, I want to help us understand where I come from. I'm a marine biologist by training, and throughout my career became a fisheries scientist. Throughout it, then I do more of the social dynamics of everything related with small-scale fishing communities. Love the ocean, love dogs. I'm from Honduras, and I've been working with Latin America for over 12 years. So I don't think I can stop working now. Too much time invested. So how did I start with this question about food and how it shows us this relationship between coast, land, and ocean? Actually, for that, I need to go a little bit into my PhD thesis, which consisted entirely, I devoted 5 years, 6 years, if we're being honest, in understanding these transitions between aquaculture and small-scale fisheries in Latin America, specifically in Baja California, Sur, Mexico, and Honduras. And with that, I started seeing a lot of questions of more than, like governance or more like the material. It was a lot of like social issues happening. And I love this photo that I took. This is a photo in Baja. This was a fishing community. And as you can see, they're using the boats now to store oyster devices for farms. So I started thinking about like these terms of displacement, dispossession, what that means, right? Because when we think of aquaculture, small-scale fishing communities, we usually think they're being displaced from their ocean space or their ocean area. But the communities were telling me different stories. They were telling me they were displaced by their identities, their culture, who they were. So that started me to think about what else is missing. Oh, I had an hour for that. Part of my PhD also was kind of like understanding these interactions between these two systems using a socio-ecological framework. And I tried to do this because you have governance, you have the social part, you have the culture and traditions that the communities kept telling me we need the culture and traditions. And this actually was the last slide of my defense. So I like it because that brought me to this question of like, okay, what else is needed? And I started to think, okay, aquaculture development must adapt to the needs of local communities. But it was not just about aquaculture. As I continued to work in Honduras and Puerto Rico, I started to realize there's more. It's not just aquaculture what's happening. So I started thinking, what if displacement and dispossession is more than just physical? What about all the relations that exist in these relational worlds where these communities exist? What about the connection between coastline and ocean? As Jim was saying, that's the reality, right? These communities, especially in Latin America, all the fishers in Latin America that I've worked with, they just don't rely on fishing. They also rely on agriculture. They fish, and when the fishing is bad or there's bad weather, they go to their little plots of land. And when you think about from the fisheries perspective, we usually think about these separate kind of like systems, ocean and coast, with an emphasis in oceans of like, how can we manage an ocean to get more food? How can we manage the coast, for example, for hotels? And it's the same. Dispossession and displacement are think about these like separate terms. But when you think of, I was talking with these communities in Puerto Rico and Honduras this past year, thanks to the Blue Food support, I started realizing that these people see this as an interconnected space between ocean, coast, and land. They're interconnected, and as they were saying, for them, dispossession and displacement is more than just capital. It's about losing relations, their identity, who they are. How food for them is more than just nutrition, it's more than that. So I started thinking, what if more than blue foods, we start thinking about blue space? How are terrestrial and ocean nutrients flowing? How when a community comes and grows, I don't know, plantain, cassava, whatever for nutrition, while they're not fishing, how does that interact? Or how are the relations in this space important for the sustenance of small-scale fisheries? Among other questions that I'm trying to still think about. But today, I'm going to be talking about what I'm doing in Honduras and Puerto Rico with food. I'm using feminist political ecology mostly, interviews, surveys, culinary chats, and food, which I'm going to be talking about today. Going back to my title and the super cool photo of this coconut plant. So why food? For these communities, food is more than just nutrition and sustenance, as I said. It carries a lot of meaning. Food is the most intimate way of telling a story, of telling a community story of resistance and resilience as well. And it can be used as to understand how fluid these dynamics are between like the terrestrial and the ocean space between this food at a local scale. And it also provides a safe space for marginalized groups to share their stories. These are just some photos I took of the food they were feeding me. And especially in Latin America, oh my God, especially in Latin America communities, food is very important. Food for us in Latin America is more than, it's just a way where, sorry, they've showed the 3 minutes, so I'm panicking. It's a space for communities to get together, to talk, to have all these relational approaches. So today I'm gonna tell the story about Mary and the coconut. So as you can see, this is Mary's patio. She has coconut, very different types of coconut, that's the ocean. Through time, Mary, I spent an entire day with her, 5 hours talking about culinary chats, how the food is prepared. She was telling me all these stories about her relationship with the land, how the women in the Garifuna communities in Honduras were the ones that harvest the land for sustenance. But with time, the government started to have issues with land, removed the land. Now the women don't have land, but there's also issues accessing the blue foods, right? Like the marine part, there's an MPA. She was also telling me that with the coconut, she has all these memories of how she spent time with her mom, with her family, how they use the beach and the coast for that. As you can see also, the connection about these three systems is shown in this thing that they use to extract coconut milk, these stones are gotten from the ocean and the rivers next to them. Again, a connection. Chickens is very important. These communities didn't have beef before. Beef was introduced recently. Now it's more expensive. They used to just rely on chicken that they fed coconut with. Coconut is very important for them, and fish. That has started to change as well. Importantly, again, you can see that they also have coconut on the lands, but because of all these issues with the government and the displacement and dispossession from the lands, now they cannot access them, right? So the question now turns something that Mary kept telling me, okay, so now we have to buy coconut milk from the grocery stores, which are super bad in chemicals, they don't have nutrients. We cannot harvest plantains, we cannot harvest yucca, we cannot get fish because there's no fish and there's all these regulations, and now fish is going for export markets. So now what do we do, right? That's the question I'm trying to solve with them. And also, very importantly, you see, they also use coconut leaves to store their fish when they come back from fishing, when the men come from their fish. And again, it's used everywhere, in all their dishes. Coconut is such an important part of their nutrients and diets, and that's the question I'm trying to solve with this postdoc on how we can kind of start thinking about small-scale fishing communities in Latin America as these interconnected spaces with all these questions related to food and identity and everything I talked to. And yes, thank you, that's me. That's some good food that I ate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my name is Gladys Mwaka. I'm a doctorate researcher in Ghent University, and at the same time, I'm a scientist or research scientist in the Flanders Marine Institute in Oostende, that is in Belgium. So my topic today is on lessons from artisanal seaweed aquaculture in Kenya, whereby we are bridging science and policy for blue food futures. And so my work asks how seaweed can move from the margins of blue economy, thinking into mainstream food system and climate decision making in ways that are equitable, evidence-based, and grounded in coastal community realities. And so that is why this fellowship was very important to me, and it creates space to connect local evidence from Kenya to wider conversations on sustainable and inclusive blue food futures. So I'll do three things today. First, I'm going to explain why seaweed and why in Kenya. And second, I'm going to show you what my research will bring in the blue food future. And three, I'm going to explain to you why it matters for blue food future. So artisanal seaweed aquaculture is already an important livelihood and food security strategy for coastal communities in Kenya and across the Western Indian Ocean. So, as shown on this slide, it supports the local economies, it creates employment, opportunities, and contributes to household survival in places where livelihood options can be limited. So at the same time, it's broader. And as a sustainable blue food pathway remains underused in climate and policy discussions. So that gap matters a lot because seaweed is not only a coastal commodity, it also speaks about nutrition, it also speaks of resiliency and sustainability. So for me, the importance of Kenya is that it offers a grounded case through which we can ask bigger questions. How do we make blue food transitions more inclusive? That is the question. And so how are we going to ensure that coastal communities are part of those transitions rather than only being affected by them? Yes, this is the second part of the argument. In such a way that it's about equity and governance. Seaweed farming is not only about production, it is also about who gets access to resources and the opportunities for empowerment. On the part of governance in blue food, seaweed aquaculture emphasizes the need for governance reforms so that it supports inclusive and sustainable practices in global blue food transitions, resonating with broader climate and biodiversity frameworks. So what does my research bring? My research brings an effort to connect the strands that are often treated separately. So I work across socioeconomic analysis, the nutritional and bioactive assessments and governance and policy pathways. So in other words, I am interested not only in whether seaweed can be farmed, but in how it can also contribute to equitable blue food transitions from coastal systems and community realities all the way to policy relevance. So the first part of my research looks at the socio-economic analysis, whereby I examine how coastal communities participate in seaweed value chains. What roles do they play? What barriers do they face? And what this means for livelihood resilience. On the equity and inclusion, I'm interested knowing what conditions can seaweed aquaculture become a sustainable economic activity for artisanal farmers. And equally important, how do we ensure that benefits are shared equally, especially among groups that are often marginalized within the coastal economy. On the nutrition and bioactive assessment, nutrition composition study, we want to assess the micronutrient and macronutrients levels in farmed seaweed to determine its dietary significance for health improvement. We also want to look at the health enhancement bioactives, regional dietary integrations. On the policy mapping, issues of governance, inclusivity strategies, and transition mechanisms. So why does it matter for blue food futures? Because we are strengthening international governance. We want to align with climate adaptation agendas. We want to integrate nutritional and trade. We also want to encourage the cross-sectoral dialogues and sharing local and global insights. Yeah, those are the most the explanations in deeper end. So I'm looking forward to turning the place-based seaweed research. I'm looking forward to practice these insights that strengthen the nutritional, climate resilience, and equitable livelihoods in coastal communities. Thank you so much.
My name is Mohammad Ruel Mia, and I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of Waterloo and a Blue Food Futures Fellow 2026. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey from a small village river to Bangladesh's two most important ecosystems and sources of blue foods. So this is the river that goes through my village in Bangladesh. And to most people, it may look very ordinary with a narrow channel, a lot of trees on the bank. But for thousands of people in my village, this is their lifeline, source of food and nutrition. They are not fishers by profession, but whenever they need food, they come to this river, cast their nets, and harvest fish, and also the river provides. Fishing is especially intense during rainy season and winter when the water level goes up and also when water level goes down. And this river is their pantry. It's always open, always providing. Just to let you know, the first two pictures, this is fishing by myself a couple of years back when I went back home for my PhD fieldwork. So the most important thing that most people are missing is that most families in my village, they just earn enough to live. Without the food, without this river, they could not simply afford their basic animal protein demand. So this is not the only story of my village and the river of my village. This is the story of more than 700 small and large rivers in my country, because Bangladesh is known as country of rivers. I didn't realize during my when I was a kid that what if the fish disappears from these rivers? What if the rivers stop feeding us? Until I started my Bachelor of Science in Fisheries Science in Bangladesh. But when I chose fisheries, the people in my community, they didn't understand it. They were like, fisheries? You study fishing? Because it's all over, it's available everywhere. So they started asking, like, in Bangladesh, if you're smart, you become a medical doctor or an engineer, not a fishers. So they were asking, like, a degree in fisheries, what are you gonna do with that? So, but their perspectives are changing now, seeing the importance of it, especially during the dry season when the river completely get dries up and the water resources goes completely collapsed. Fisheries are getting declined. Now see that what I'm also doing, they understand it better. I have inspired the youth and next generation in my village and my community through my work, and now they clearly see the value of the fisheries. So now let me take you to another important ecosystem in Bangladesh, which is also blessed with abundant fisheries resources. The Sundarbans mangrove forest, situated in the coast of Bay of Bengal. This is the largest continuous mangrove forest in the world, shared between Bangladesh and India. This provides food sources for more than 12 million people from both India and Bangladesh, income, livelihoods, and everything. This is an ecologically critical area and a Ramsar site. I have sat with the communities, talked to them, their issues, the struggles they deal with every day, especially how the conservation policies exclude them from the forest and benefiting from there, and also how the women are marginalized and underrepresented, even though they have huge contribution to the communities and the economy. So during my PhD, I particularly focused on what are the vulnerabilities that the communities are facing, and what are the strategies and pathways to address them and move towards viability, and what role the governance plays in this transition. So I'll try to present a little bit about my PhD research. So this is the first one I did, is a systematic scoping literature review at the global scale about the sources of vulnerabilities and the responses, typical responses that people make at the community, government, and different NGO level. So the results suggest that most of the sources of vulnerabilities are multidimensional, they're diverse, and the responses they're making, they're ineffective to the most extent. And also the responses are ineffective because they mostly focuses on technical fixes at the day-to-day level, ignoring the root causes, and there is a gap remaining in understanding what is the role of governance, proper structure and functioning. So I came up with this conceptual framework to further dig into how to analyze the capacity and quality of the governing system, drawing from interactive governance and governability lenses. And I applied it in my fieldwork and collected the data. So my first empirical findings suggest that, similar to global, small-scale fisheries in Bangladesh also face vulnerabilities sourced from social, natural, and governance factors. The results also suggest that the current governance system and they are not structured properly. They fail to address the vulnerabilities that small-scale fishing communities face and help towards moving towards viability. Several factors include the lack of common governing actions between India and Bangladesh. There is a mismatch in terms of their interests and values, a mismatch in terms of the common goals and implementation. So I further looked into the governing system, in particular, why it's not working. So the results suggest that the current governing system lacks proper structure, arrangements, and interaction, and also the performances and effectiveness are in poor condition. So when I asked people about whether the current governance system fits really into the problem and vulnerabilities that they face. So as you can see, the inner circle shows that most of them, they disagree. And also they have listed some of the main reasons why the current governance system doesn't fit into their context. And when I also asked about their ability, the current governing system's ability, whether they can really facilitate this transition from vulnerability to viability, again, most of them said no. And these are some of the reasons that they feel why they are not able to address the vulnerabilities in this transboundary forest. So let me take you to a different Bangladesh. This is Tanguar Har, another Ramsar site, an ecology, world and important ecology. And this is a vast freshwater basin located in the northeastern side of Bangladesh. And it provides, similar to the other ones, provides food, nutrition, income, and employment opportunities for millions in this area. Here too, again, the same tension plays out: conservation versus protection, conservation versus livelihoods, protection versus access. Two different ecosystems, but the challenges, especially governance-related challenges, are similar. So with the support from Blue Food Futures program, I plan to expand my PhD research on those two ecosystems, do a couple of case studies in Tanguar Har and also in the Sundarbans mangrove forest, and explore whether the current governing system is capable enough to achieve the ecological protection and also maintaining the food production for the millions. And also, I plan to see if there is any impossible trade-offs that on the people that depend on this ecosystem the most. By comparing those two sides, I plan to look at what works, what doesn't work, and where the interventions can actually make a difference. So I stand here today, a boy from that small village, because for me, equitable blue food transition is really important. The fishing communities in Bangladesh, in Sundarbans, they don't know me, those who I haven't talked to. And the families in Tanguar, they never heard of Stanford or Blue Food Futures program, or maybe they don't even know most of the partners. But they are the reason why I'm here today. So with this fellowship, I commit to amplify their voices, amplify why Blue Food is important, why their contribution is important. They are not invisible. They are the backbone of Blue Food system for millions. Thank you.
My name is Piwe. The PH is not an F. And I'm from one of the coastal provinces in South Africa originally, which is the Eastern Cape, which is the same province that Steve Biko, some decolonial scholars like Nelson Mandela himself are from. And so from the Xhosa clan, I'm quite proud of that. And I think my identity and my positionality really informs the kind of work that I'm part of and the kind of work that I care to do. And this presentation should aim to capture that all in the context of South African ocean governance specifically. So just to take a step back and really just be so grateful for my previous fellow Blue Food Futures fellows in sort of encapsulating so much of the themes of justice already and spatiality, and really taking a deeper look at what it means to have just access to food systems, because I think context really matters in that sense. As you can probably tell, I'm from a more humanities background in my ocean governance scholarship. And so I'm really interested in sort of understanding these conflicts in blue oceans from a societal perspective and governance at that. So in the mid-15th centuries, colonial forces invaded South African coasts, including Zululand, where this research is based, reordering land and sea access for generation through displacement and dispossession of indigenous communities from the coastlines. In 1975, apartheid-era concessions handed Richards Bay coastlines to mining nationals. And today, under the banner of a blue economy, we're still negotiating who belongs where, who benefits, and who pays the cost. My research asks, what does it mean to pursue a so-called blue or sustainable blue future in a space so deeply scarred by historical injustice? I'm sure many of you have seen this, stark representation of South Africa's inequality spatially. But South Africa is widely recognized as one of the most unequal societies in the world. And even today, the top 20% earners control over 65% of the country's resources. And the so-called bottom 40% live on just 7% of the country's resources. But these inequalities aren't just economic, they're spatial too. They were carved out into land and sea through colonial conquest and apartheid spatial planning that determined who had access and who did not. And so in post-apartheid ocean governance, despite many reforms post-1994 or post our democratic dispensation, the ocean space specifically still remains an unequal space, and these inequalities persist as legacies of apartheid and colonial conquest. It is within this fragile and unequal landscape that the blue economy agenda is unfolding, focusing on GDP growth through shipping, coastal mining, offshore oil and gas, aquaculture, fisheries, both commercial and as of late, small-scale fisheries. But this growth runs up against deep questions of injustice. So to provide a quick context to South Africa's ocean seascape, South Africa has quite a unique coastal livelihoods framework in the sense that small-scale fishers are organized in communities and indigenous communities across the four coastal provinces, from the sort of Atlantic Sea side from where I'm in Cape Town, going to the south coast and the Indian Ocean, where the study site is in Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And so how individuals engage with fisheries is not in the similar way that fishers markets would sort of unfold in other African countries, like in Ghana, for example, or Mozambique even, or Kenya for that matter. South African fisheries themselves are displaced and dispossessed, and so they have an inability to access marine resources in a way that makes sense for their coastal livelihoods and their food security. And so marine conservation in particular has been a conflictual point between coastal livelihoods and the ability to access resources. This conflict represents the displacement from coastal land and inhibiting of access to marine resources by these apartheid and colonial spatial planning legacies. And this is evident in environmental law too. So in the democratic dispensation, these legacies often include exclusions from decision-making processes about the ocean governance, multiple human rights violations such as fishers being killed for fishing, and food insecurity and threatened livelihoods through the expansion of industries such as coastal mining. In fact, just north of where the study is placed in 2024, through a project that I was part of called the One Ocean Hub, we sort of incapacitated individuals from a community called Libera, who had suffered 2 killings of small-scale fishers by provincial conservation authorities in the Isimangaliso UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so there's a lot of conflict within these spaces where individuals have their fishing groups have their human rights violated because of unclear and vague conservation laws that often prioritize extractive industries. And so you have a situation in South Africa because of these sort of historic injustices. Only about 8,000 to 12,000 small-scale fishers, or what the law calls bona fide small-scale fishers, are legally recognized, even though there are traditional fishers and traditional coastal livelihood producers who are not sort of captured in this data. This is what's seen as legitimate to a large extent. And so the background of this is where South Africa's oceans economy mandate sort of unfolds, and it's called the Oceans Economy Master Plan. And in practice, this blue economy and ocean economy terms are used interchangeably, but both are aimed at sort of boosting the GDP and job creation through the sectors that are displayed on the screen. While the language has evolved about how blue economies are described, the underlying emphasis is one of a capitalistic expansion, often without fully addressing questions of equity and community participation. So I won't go into great detail of my research objectives for this project, but essentially it aims to understand the emerging conflicts that are shaping South Africa's blue economy. And I sort of drew and undertake this analysis using the Richards Bay case in KwaZulu-Natal, and I approached this work with an intersectional lens, one that takes very seriously the historical and political and economic inequalities, as well as conflicting worldviews about what the ocean should be and who it should serve. And so to do this, I focus on several areas, analyzing the socioeconomic condition of ocean-dependent communities, and also identifying actors involved in these blue economy conflicts and how each imagines or claims the ocean space itself. I also look at how the communities excluded or how their participation is enabled in blue economy decision-making processes and public participation and so on. And so I do all of this using Henry Lefebvre's production of space to develop the sort of analytical tool for understanding how these conflicts are produced and reproduced over time. And through this, I aim to show that blue economy isn't just about an economic project, but it is also a site of struggle over space, justice, and belonging. So just, slight background on Lefebvre's production of space. It uses the ideology that space is, it shows through the spatial triad. Lefebvre shows us that how physical environments are not simply containers where life unfolds, but that they are actively shaped through politics, economics, social power, and history. And so this theory sort of organizes this by shaping space into conceived space, lived space, and perceived space, where the framework itself shows us who the actors are involved in shaping the social dynamic of a space. The kind of, I suppose, the knowledge hierarchies and epistemic hierarchies that exist and ontological hierarchies that are either invited into decision making or those that are set aside. And so these are these elements of the triad are in a dialectical relationship, and I use them to sort of explain what happens on the ocean space as far as conflict goes. And although originally developed as a critique of capitalistic terrestrial town planning, the fact of spatial triad is useful for ocean and coastal contexts because it provides a framework that does not assume space is neutral, apolitical, or ahistorical, or predictable for that matter, in the way that marine spatial planning, for example, does. So instead, Atlas scholars like Movik bring attention to the production of space and how it has utility in revealing how coastal and marine areas are actively shaped by enclosures, by rescaling, by resistance. So the area that I've been speaking about is Richards Bay on the Indian coastline, is in a province called KwaZulu-Natal. Just taking you to the southernmost part of the continent, but it lies on the Indian Ocean specifically. And this area is of particular interest to me because there are socioeconomic disparities in that the bay itself is organized and is categorized as an industrial development zone, but the traditional authorities, meaning the communities that are organized by tribal authority in the area, are one of the poorest, some of the poorest communities in the South African coastline. Specifically, I focused on 2 small-scale fishing villages. These were of interest to me after a scoping exercise where I sort of spoke to some of the women and men who were fishing in these areas. And in the east coast of South Africa, what's quite distinctive that livelihoods are quite diverse. So small-scale fishing communities are also communities that partake in small-scale agriculture. They, as Liliana also mentioned in the Latin American example, and they also have engaged in different kinds of trades and livelihood options as a way to sort of supplement dwindling small-scale fisheries and fish stocks in general. So under these 2 images on the screen at the moment show how the estuary, that is the fishing zone, as traditionally recognized by these communities, has been shaped over time. On your left, my right, you have we see the original lagoon or the original estuary that the community has fished in for centuries before. And it's a large interconnected estuarine system. We hear about these sort of socio-ecological complex systems that are interconnected, and sort of this case really shows a disparity between the planning tools that sort of assume that space is static and therefore can be zoned. Whereas we clearly see from this example that this is incorrect, and there are cumulative impacts because of how dynamic and fluid the ocean space is. And then on the right, which is a 2021 aerial image of what the estuary looks like today. And it was split in 1976 into what is in the northern part of it, Richards Bay Harbour. This is the deepest harbour in the southern hemisphere, and it is also a coal terminal. And so towards the south of this coal terminal, communities still exist just on the southern part of the Umhlatuze estuary, and still use this estuary as a very vital and important part of their livelihoods. Although, because of the human change, the estuary has changed substantially and is sort of by ecologists deemed to be in poor condition. But nonetheless, communities still perceive this not only as one single system, although it has been split in half, but they consider it as a very vital part of not only their livelihoods, but where they pray and conduct spiritual practices, and where women sort of socialize amongst themselves and men do the same. So over the duration of my PhD, I sort of took time to conduct some research in the area. I did a few household surveys, oral history interviews, focus group, key informant interviews with some industry players to sort of get a sense of this remote area and the socioeconomic conditions and some conflict points that I might be missing. And the data I organized the data to sort of show conflict as far as conflict arenas, using the sort of spatial production as a conceptual and theoretical lens. And it showed me that marine planning is really shaped by specific individuals. And so these are the powerful actors in this area. It was the Rio Tinto mining subsidiaries that existed. It was port authorities. This also included provincial conservation authorities that manage the estuary as a protected area. And these individuals have this, technical knowledge systems, these very Western ideas about what space is and what the ocean means and how it ought to be used. And these knowledge systems dominated and were prioritized in ocean governance planning in South Africa over place-based and indigenous knowledge systems, where communities sort of had a more spiritual and intangible ontological experience and identity with the ocean itself. And the second conflict arena, which is an overriding theme in this research, was that communities in Richards Bay also disproportionately bear the brunt of these conflicts that exist. And so this conflict really exists at the center, or emerges at the center of unaddressed historical dispossession, where there isn't redress, reparative justice specifically, as well as the ignorance of ontological and epistemic knowledge from these communities against blue economy ventures, for example. And so how these communities bear the brunt of this conflict is that they sort of hold the burden of overcoming challenges with food sovereignty, and where access is restricted to fishing by attempting to fish in multiple ecosystems. So they will go to the near shore, out of the estuary to the near shore, or they will go to the local lake and try to sort of plug those food security holes with fishing in freshwater ecosystems. Or they'll use recreational fishing licenses. In South Africa, there is a very racialized dynamic of fishing permits and fisheries rights. Recreational fishers licenses are often seen to be for the privileged population. And so this is a less politicized or less policed fishing license due to class and racial dynamics. You often see this in affluent areas along the coastline. And so they sort of manipulate the system in these ways to try to overcome food security and not having sovereignty over their own food futures amid a very vague fishing governance system. And so doing so, they also fish at times they perceive to have low law enforcement or surveillance. So they'll fish at night during the night time, or try to fish, in ways that sort of study the patterns of law enforcement. This is my conclusion. It's a rather odd conclusion, but I wanted to conclude by sort of introducing this decolonial blue spatial justice framework that this research is developing, in that it sort of organizes, it takes from the spatial triad by identifying which actors are involved and how relationships in view of how the ocean space should be used, but have a sort of influence by decolonial thought leaders like Fanon, for an example, who critique space for who sort of critique spatial injustice for its legacies and how it shapes mentality and imagination, and therefore the idea of thriving futures being colonized before they exist. I'll be happy to speak more on this conceptual framework that I've developed, and any other questions. This is my email address, and I'd love to connect more with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today, for being part of the Blue Food Futures program. Thank you.